sort of kick off with a very simple question, a policy question. What do you think it would take to speed up the economic recovery and the pace of job growth?
Actually, I wrote a whole book about it, you know. But I think, first of all, let's analyze what the problems are. First, it's funny, Governor Brown and I were talking about it downstairs. There is now, in theory, plenty of money just in corporate treasuries and in banks, uncommitted to loans, and unnecessary to cover the bad housing holdings of American banks, that is where they still hold the mortgages. That's about $200 billion. There's still almost $2 trillion in cash in banks available to loans now, which means that if they loan money on a very conservative ratio of 10 to 1, in theory, there's $20 trillion worth of lending capacity out there. And now there's not $20 trillion worth of good loan demand, but that's important to know. And so you have to ask yourself, well, what are the things we could do that would loosen this up, make more business people want to borrow, more of them want to lend? How can we do it in a way that would generate more jobs and more incomes? And I do have some ideas. First of all, I think there should be a determined effort by the government to accelerate the resolution of the home mortgage crisis. And I favor an approach articulated by a professor at Harvard named Kenneth Rogoff, who says that we should lower what people, there's an enormous amount of mortgages now that are worth more than their homes. And a lot of the people who hold those mortgages, by the way, are not delinquent yet. And they didn't have subprime mortgages, and they contributed in no way, shape, or form to what's going on. But home values are depressed, and California's got this in spades. You know, it's just a terrible problem. So what Rogoff recommends is that a version, basically, of what I did with farms in Arkansas in the early 80s. We had a big farm crisis in the middle of the country. He says that he understands why the guy that's running Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who, along with the VA and the Federal Housing Agency, have about 60% of the bad mortgages in the country now. He understands why the guy says, well, if I just write all those mortgages down to the value of the homes, the taxpayers will lose money. Well, if he doesn't, the taxpayers will lose money too. But if you're worried about unjust enrichment, what you could do, and what Rogoff suggests, is lower the mortgage payment down to the value of the home. That is, but instead of just forgiving that rest, just convert it into an equity investment in the home, let the holder of the mortgage hold that. Then when the home is sold, once the prices rise and go back beyond the low ceiling, then the holder of the mortgage will split the profits with the homeowner. So you benefit the homeowner with lower payments now, you get the economy recovering, and you stop so many of these darn foreclosures. Then take the stock of foreclosed houses, that particularly the ones the government owns, and to try to stop them from all being thrown back on the market at the same time, rent them out at a low rate that covers the property tax, the utility bills, the maintenance costs, and a small fee for whoever's handling the service, and you stop flooding the market with depressed properties. I think if we did it and did it in a hurry, there would be very little injustice done and a lot of economic jolt in it. You got to clear these bad debts, and the quicker we do it, the better. And this way you don't unjustly enrich anybody. You just say, you face the way the world is and ask people to take a risk on the upside. I think the second thing we should do is to recognize that the one place our tax system is not competitive with our competitors around the world anymore is in the corporate tax rate. When I raised corporation taxes on income, corporations making over $10 million a year to their current rates, it was smack dab in the middle of the global corporate tax rates. That is, the middle was 35%. Today, the middle is 24%, and we're still at 35. Only Japan is higher, and for a complex set of reasons that all of you do business there and understand, they don't have the same movement problems we do of companies or capital. So we need corporate tax reform. We need to broaden the base and lower the rates and offer real incentives to repatriate the capital to reinvest it. The third thing we should do is to follow what used to be a strongly bipartisan idea and set up a national infrastructure bank with both public and private capital. One thing you could do is to provide some extra incentive to repatriate the capital, is let it be brought back for nothing if immediately, before you even pass the bill, if companies invest in the infrastructure bank. And the ROI is quite good for the companies. And then you could put a lot of people to work doing things like modernizing not just traditional infrastructure, which cost us $150 to $200 billion a year in just waiting costs on roads and, you know, car repairs and damage to homes and other things from broken water and sewer systems. But our broadband infrastructure ranks only 15th in the world. It's embarrassing for me to be right here and say that. South Korea's download speeds are 4 times ours. They rank first in the world. And it's dramatically impeding our ability to use the internet and e-commerce to bring economic opportunity to small towns in rural America. So it wouldn't cost that much money to fix that. Another thing that's hurting us is the absence of an electrical grid. We have 140 different electrical grids, and they're sort of connected. That is, to avoid a brownout, you can inefficiently wheel power all across America. But you can't take advantage of the fact that America ranks first or second in the world in every single international survey in terms of our capacity to generate electricity from the sun and the wind. President Bush's Energy Department, not President Obama's or mine, President Bush's, said that we have enough wind in North Dakota alone to electrify 25% of America. In North Dakota. And that there's enough wind blowing from North Dakota's border with Canada to the West Texas border with Mexico to electrify America many times over. But except for California and urban Arizona and urban Nevada, by and large in America, the sun shines and the wind blows where the people aren't. So I remember I was making a couple of speeches for Hillary on the night before the Texas primary in 2008, and I was making a trip I've been making for 40 years now up the Rio Grande River. And this guy had given me a whole bunch of pickups to stand on, and I was wearing my boots, and I nearly got blown off the truck in Del Rio and Eagle Pass because the wind was blowing 46 miles an hour in both places. And my friends there said, oh, it blows this way every night. Not a windmill in sight. And keep in mind, Texas already has so much wind energy that on a good day it'll generate 25% of electricity from the wind. And where it's windy is no windmills because they had no transmission capacity. So we need to build that. So I would do that. And then I think there ought to be a massive effort to retrofit every public building in this country, every school, every college, every city, county, and local building, and do it on terms where they and also business owners with buildings that aren't too heavily encumbered by debt can pay back the savings entirely from lower power bills. Entirely. So it's a just say yes system. You don't have to pay any more money. And you give the electric companies the cheapest power they can get in terms of greater capacity to finance future growth, and you can generate 7,000 jobs for every $1 billion invested, which is about 8 times what you get out of building a new nuclear or coal-fired power plant. If you just started there, there's 15 other things I think we should do, but if you just started with those things, people would say, America's on the move. America's going to be competitive. We're going to go back to the top of the heap. And that's where I would begin. One last thing, since I'm in California, I don't want to forget this. I think it is a big mistake, this whole anti-immigration snit we've been on. I mean, the first place, Mexican immigration's going down not only because we made it tougher to get in, but because the rewards of getting here are not as great anymore. And we actually might have to start cutting our own grass and things if we don't. We got to quit this. This is good. This immigration is good for us. You have to understand. Remember what I said? We have the most diverse workforce in the world. We're younger than Europe. We're younger than Japan. We'll soon be younger than China. It's not because we're having more babies. It's because of immigration. It is our meal ticket to the future. We want all these people from Asia and Latin America and everywhere else who want to come here and make a contribution. And I think just to take the skilled H-1B visas, until we close the gap that are in what we need in the STEM fields and what we got, I would take the lid off of these visas because all these people create more jobs than they ever cost. And let me tell you what it would take to close the gap. If women, Hispanics, and African Americans went into the STEM fields at the same rate as males of European, Middle Eastern, and Asian heritage did, within 8 years, there would be no gap in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics requirements in America. But for 8 years, we ought to do that. If we started with those things, I'll tell you, people would look at America in a whole new light, and we'd be off and running. That's what I believe.
Thank you, thank you. Very, very, very good. It's a policy question that I've asked, and now a politics question that's probably the most popular question that's on this page. What are the keys to a presidential victory in 2012?
Well, the keys are different for Obama and for Romney, but the song is the same. And what do I mean by that? Then I want to make a point that relates to politics about the last question. You notice I didn't say anything about the debt. I hate this debt. Remember, 4 of my 8 budgets were surplus budgets. I hate this debt. But if you look at all the people that say, let's just cut now. All I say is look at what's happened to the European Union. You cannot get blood out of a turnip. If you want to balance the budget, it requires 3 things. The appropriate spending levels and discipline for the long term on the health care mostly. That's the biggest problem in the spending driver. The appropriate revenue stream and a reasonable level of growth. And if you don't have any growth, then you can tax the top 1%, and thank God I finally got in that group. And I'm one of these guys that I want my taxes to go back to where they were under me. And I think it was crazy to drive this country back into debt in times of economic growth. I thought I had disproved that theory, but apparently not to enough people. And I'm fine on it. But you can tax me at 100%, and if there's no private demand and no private investment, it won't lead to a balanced budget. And you can have all the austerity and budgets you want, and you won't be able to balance the budget because what will happen is revenues will drop more than you cut spending. So we have to have a growth strategy. The Simpson-Bowles Commission, I like for a lot of reasons. You don't have to like it, but you should know this. Its perhaps most important bipartisan statement was, do not do any of this until we have growth clearly underway, or it too will fail. So, what's the trajectory? President Obama, without making excuses, needs to be able to have people like me say, look, for 500 years, whenever there's been a collapse of the financial system, it's taken a country between 5 and 10 years to get back to full employment. For the last couple of hundred years, when buildings had been widely held by individuals and companies, so there's been a private mortgage system, if there's a mortgage collapse on top of a finance collapse, it almost always takes around 10 years. When this happened to Japan with the most modern infrastructure in the world and a massive stimulus plan to build amazing things, which will help them for 40 years, they still weren't out of it after a decade. So the job of the American president is to try to create the conditions and give people the tools to do what we Americans used to be pretty good at, which is beating the odds. We're supposed to beat the clock. We can't wait 10 years. We already had, 8 years of flat incomes before the whole thing happened. And we didn't have any private sector job growth before that, so we need to move ahead. And so he needs to argue that in the last couple of years we've had 4 million new jobs, that is more jobs than were produced in the 7 years and 8 months of the previous administration before the financial meltdown, that we have replaced virtually all the jobs that were lost in the crash. And that, therefore, the last thing we want to do is to go back and adopt the policies that got us in trouble in the first place. He has to sell the American people on that. He has to defend what he did in the automobile restructuring, which I personally think was one of his best accomplishments and was entirely forged by him. It was not a bailout. We put in some money. We already got half of it back. But labor had to give, management had to give. There's 80-something thousand more people working in the car business. And I grew up in the car business. There are 1.5 million people at least who saved their jobs because we decided it'd be a good thing if America's companies could make cars. And so I think that was a good thing. He has to defend health care. I don't understand this reluctance the Democrats have to talk about this. Aetna, the biggest insurance company in the country, filed recently in Connecticut to lower their insurance rates because the law requires 85% of your premium to go to your health care and only 15% to profits and overhead. And I was at a big health care conference last week with Aetna and a lot of other insurance companies, a lot of people running health care providers and everything. Almost 100% of them said to me, dear God, I hope the Supreme Court doesn't repeal this and make us start all over again. It was very interesting. The health care, they said, because they are starting to pay for performance instead of per procedure. You want to know what you can do to make the American economy more competitive? Stop paying 18% of our GDP for health care when none of our competitors pay more than 12. That's $1 trillion a year we're paying for a system that doesn't insure 100% of the people and gives us about the 30th highest life expectancy in the world. They know we can do better, and they're doing it. Does that mean this bill is perfect? No. But there's all the incentive in the world for bipartisan cooperation to clean it up now. They've already cleaned up the small business reporting requirements, which were a mess. It needed to be fixed. But if you go back to square one, then nothing will ever pass until you decide to give somebody 60 votes in the Senate again, a filibuster-proof majority. So if I were him, I'd defend it. If you do something and you don't talk about it, people think you're ashamed of it. I'd go out and, I talk about it every chance I get. I turn right into it. When I grew up in Arkansas and I got into politics and we talked about controversy, a guy said, Bill, he said, it's like this. You take these polls and they tell you, don't talk about this, it's unpopular. Talk about these 3 things you did that are popular. But if you go into your neighbor's house and there's a pink elephant in the living room, you don't really get very far telling them how pretty their sofa is. Sooner or later, you got to acknowledge there's a pink elephant in the living room, and your neighbor will think you're rude if you don't talk about it. So anyway, I think he should do that. But I think he should run on his record and talk about what he's going to do in the next 4 years. And the most important things he should say in his attack on Governor Romney is, do you really want to go back and adopt the policies that got us in trouble in the first place? He's basically promising to return to President Bush, or he's saying President Bush was too liberal. He wants to do what the Tea Party wants to do, which means he wants to do what the European Union is now doing. Whoever thought the Republican Party would embrace old Europe's economic policy? But anyway, so that's what I'd do if I were in his position. If I were Mitt Romney, I would say, look, what we're doing is not working fast enough. And basically, even if everything President Obama did was perfect, which I don't think it was, and he can't run away with what he said from what he said in the primary, which is probably a problem. I would try to convince people that because I had been in business, understood that businesses are complex ecosystems and you can only handle so much change at once. And I would say the Democrats have tried to get us to do too much change. Dodd-Frank has too much change in it. The most important thing we had to do was to put a capital floor in to all of our financial institutions so there'd be enough capital to insure against risk. And I just go through the whole thing and say, we got to simplify this. And then I would try to convince people that Grover Norquist was wrong. You know who Grover Norquist is, the anti-tax activist? He sent out a letter that could beat Romney. He sent out a letter to all these conservatives. He said, don't worry about Romney getting nominated. Romney will be fine. Because when we get the White House, we already got the Congress. The House is going to run the government anyway. All Romney has to be able to do is sign his name. That's what he said.
Oh boy.
And Mitt Romney is going to have to convince people sooner or later that there is something, somewhere, he will say no to his right wing on, or he can't win the election. So, but both of them have to remember that, and President Obama's gotten much, much better about this in the last 8 months. I've seen it. I have to remember this election is not about them. This election is about millions of Americans who are scared to death, full of anxiety, hurting, thinking they're never going to be able to send their kids to college, living in California and thinking that the cost of college is going to go God knows where because of all these budget cuts that have to be made. This election is about the American people. Romney has the advantage that people don't feel like everything's right. Obama has the advantage that people like him, they trust him, they think he's been a good commander-in-chief, and they basically have to admit that he can point to very specific things which prove that in the last 2 years the job picture seems to be improving. And that will argue for a close election if both succeed in talking about how they would build the economy going forward. But if governor gets caught in the weeds of, you know, whether we should be against contraception or something, he's going to get in trouble, I think. And I say this, I don't have anything personally against Mitt Romney. He helped me save the AmeriCorps program when President Bush took office. But it's sad that his best accomplishment he has to deny now. The individual mandate was originally a Republican idea advanced by John Chafee from Rhode Island. And it was in the health care bill Mitt Romney signed that a Democratic legislature passed. I'll tell you something about health care in Massachusetts. It's high. It's the 7th most expensive in the country. But before he signed the bill, it was the 2nd most expensive in the country. And because they stopped all that cost shifting and all that paperwork and all the gobbledygook and said everybody has to take some personal responsibility, inflation and healthcare costs in Massachusetts since the individual mandate was signed and the healthcare plan went up have been substantially less than inflation and healthcare costs in the country as a whole. And unfortunately, he can't brag on that because he's already said, you know, that's when he was governor. It's like the Salem witch trials in reverse. It's saying, you know, I was governor of a very sinful place, so I had to sin to be a faithful representative. And now I wish to be liberated to be president of heaven, where I will only be able to do things that the ideological theocrats in my party say is good. So the poor guy had to actually stand up there and deny one of the most successful medical experiments in modern American history. I felt bad for him. But it ought to be a pretty close race because they both are smart, they're both articulate, they both have accomplished things in their lives, and the economy is in, for most people, at best, an ambiguous situation. So it'll probably be a pretty close race. But I predict, because of the difficulties created for the governor by his political base, and because of things that he had to say to win the nomination, that the president will win by 5 or 6 points. That's what I think will happen. But I think, and I really think he's done a good job. But but no one believed. I wish he'd been able to say when the thing collapsed on September the 15th, 2008. That's 7 weeks from the election. And I wish they'd been able to just take a week off and sort this through, and he could have said, look, this changes the universe, and it's going to take longer than I thought. Because then he wouldn't be looking, he can't say that now. It looked like he was making excuses. So guys like me have to say it. Really, because, you know, but it's, I think he's done a good job. But I think Romney is an admirable man with an admirable family and an admirable business career who's stuck in a thicket because the primary on his side looked more like the Spanish Inquisition than an election. You know, you flunk question 4 and you're out of here. Get out of there. And so, and all these other candidates basically, you know, they auditioned to become the non-Romney because they were, in theory, ideologically more pure. That's the last thing we need. This is a thinking election, not an ideological election. We have to figure out how to work together. And if I had a doctrinaire left-winger who was in my party, I would tell you the same thing. We have to think, and we have got to do this together. This is a highly complicated thing. And nobody is going to be right all the time.
We're literally out of time, but we rarely have an opportunity to have this remarkable president with us. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes more, if it's okay. A political question that sort of glows a little bit in the Obama corner. As the president of the United States, is it easier to be more effective in a first term or a second term?
Well, most history says in the first term because there's the glow, the energy, the whatever. But that wasn't necessarily my experience. I mean, the most important thing I did for the long-term health of the economy was to pass my first economic plan that I had to pass with only votes from my party because it did 90% of the work of balancing the budget, and it did so in a way that moved 100 times as many people out of poverty as were moved out during the Reagan years, even though we only had like 30% more jobs.
Didn't the vice president have to cast the deciding vote?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, Al Gore used to say, whenever I vote, we win. Because I say, well, if we didn't, we'd have a constitutional crisis. I stick my head in an oven, otherwise everything's fine. But this is important, but here's what I learned about that whole lame duck business. It's more in your mind and in your team's mind than it is in the American people's mind. And I told everybody from the beginning, I said, look, people hired us to get up here and go to work. And at some point, I'll run for re-election, but we're still being hired to do a job. This is a hiring decision, an election. And then when I got reelected, I said, now everybody's going to expect us to run out of steam slowly, and because a lot of you want to leave, you want to go on with your life, you'll take other jobs. But I said, if you stay here, I expect you to come to work just as excited as you were a year ago. And what we did to organize, we had an organized strategy to combat lame duckness. And what it was, you're laughing, but it worked. We had a theme that we had gotten America out of the dumps, and now we were going to build the bridge to the 21st century. And we had a whole agenda. And then each year, we organized that agenda around the State of the Union speech. So we would start 6 months ahead of time, organizing around the State of the Union speech, and we would work and work and work and come up with ideas that everybody believed passionately in that we could do for a whole year. And about half of them would require congressional action, and about half of them were things we could do something on, whether or not we got a bill through Congress or not. So that in 99 and 2000, when we were all supposed to be out of steam, everybody was still excited. We were working on the State of the Union. Once we made the State of the Union, everybody had promised to do things. They sort of had to show up and go to work. And lo and behold, the government worked just like it did before. And those last 2 years were two of our most productive years because we had an agenda. We had something to look forward to when we got up in the morning. We knew what was the logical outgrowth of what had happened the year before. And so I believe that, and I would say this to any executive, by the way, who's approaching retirement. Anytime you have a job where there's a finite end, but the mission doesn't end, or the enterprise doesn't end, what you got to do is to make sure you have an agenda that doesn't end until you do. And if you do that, you don't have to be a lame duck, not ever. It was one of the most rewarding things we did. I keep hoping someday somebody will write a little political science monograph about it, because I think every president could do it.
One last question. What's next for Hillary?
I don't know. You know, she's had an interesting 20 years. We're in the White House, and she got elected to the Senate from New York. She adored being a senator from New York. And she gave all this attention to the little towns in upstate New York, which are a lot like North Arkansas. Amazing. Fascinating history, the Underground Railroad, the women's movement was born there, the whole 9 yards. And she brought economic opportunities there that no one ever had. A lot of people for a while thought she was the governor. But Andrew Cuomo's done a great job with that. He didn't fall off the truck yesterday, and he saw that, and he's made a real emphasis on it. But anyway, she loved being a senator. And then she ran for president, and then she immediately went into helping President Obama. Then lo and behold, he asked her to be Secretary of State, which she never thought he would do. It never even occurred to her. And she took the job, and I personally think she's done a really good job. I'm very proud of her. And the one thing that I am so grateful for is that finally, people without regard to party or philosophy or whether they agree with her or not, at least they see her in her public life the way I have seen her as long as I've known her. She just, I mean, you see it. She gets up every day. She shows up for work. It doesn't matter what the hill is. She tries to push the rock up it. And she just does it. And she's very straightforward and extremely gifted about getting very talented people who are extremely loyal to what's going on. And I think a lot of my Republican friends who ironically respect the fact that she's been a strong independent voice but very loyal to the president. They respect the fact that she knows what that job is and that she can't represent America faithfully unless she and the president are singing out of the same hymnal. And so I'm happy. But she is really tired. I mean, she's traveled like a demon, you know, and heck, I thought I had energy, and she's works harder than I do. You know, she laughs at me when I get tired traveling, tells me what a wuss I'm becoming in my old age. And so she's going to come home and rest up. I don't know. I hope she'll come to work in the foundation with me, and there are things that we can do together for as long as she wishes to do that, because she was involved in the work I do today long before I ever was. She set up, she was one of the first students active in the legal aid program at Yale, When she became a law professor at Arkansas, she set up the first legal services program we ever had. When she became First Lady of our state, she set up the Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, which is one of the premier child advocate groups in the country. She brought in from Israel a home instruction program for preschool kids, teaching parents to be their kids' first teachers, which has worked terrifically in Israel to integrate kids whose parents were not Hebrew speakers or English speakers. And it's worked well in rural America. And now it's in 27 states, all over the country, but the biggest chapter is still in Arkansas. So much that the international organization decided to move the headquarters from New York City down there. So she's always done the kind of stuff I do now. She was there decades before I was, and she's, like most things, probably better at it than I am. So we could, if that's what she wants to do, that would make me happy. But the main thing is, I think she's earned a year to do whatever she wants. And I'm for that, whatever that turns out to be.
On behalf of the Bay Area Council, the Silicon Valley, the people of California, and the people of the United States, we are so grateful to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, folks. Thank you.